We are pleased to have you join us for our Data Management and Sharing Plan workshop. Our presentation today will be led by Dr. Nick Ruhs in the University Libraries. He's the Research Data Management Librarian and an expert in all things data management and sharing plans. So we're excited to have him here today. For the purposes of today's workshop, because we do have many attendees, we're asking that if you have any questions during the presentation to please put them in the chat. We've set aside ample time for an extended Q&A session at the end of today's workshop, and especially any questions and their new policy for data management and sharing, we will be sure to go over in great detail. So again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Also, today's session will be recorded and shared on our on-demand learning page, and the slides will be distributed to you after today's session so that you have all of the links to all of the resources that Dr. Ruhs is providing today. So with that, I will hand it over and look forward to learning more.
All right, thank you, Nicole. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Nicole said, my name is Dr. Nick Ruhs. I'm with FSU Libraries, and today I'm going to be talking about data management and sharing plans, sort of giving an overview of data management policies and guidelines. We'll be doing some focus on the new NIH data management and sharing policy and guidelines, but a lot of the information that I talk about today will be applicable to data management plans and guidance from many different federal funding agencies. So just a brief overview of what we're going to go over today. I'm going to start with a bit of background information. We're going to talk about what we mean when we say research data or scientific research data, and then what we mean by research data management, what that sort of encompasses. We're going to transition then a little bit into talking about some memorandums from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which sort of set the stage for a lot of the data management guidance from different federal funding agencies that we're seeing coming out now. Then we'll go into a general overview of funder requirements. We'll spend some time focusing on components for the new NIH DMSP guidelines that will take effect next week. And then the last portion of today's workshop will talk about some resources and tools that can help you when you are crafting a data management and sharing plan, go over and demo a couple of different resources that might be beneficial. All right, so I want to start out by talking about research data. And what do we mean when we say research data? Because as we know, a lot of folks are doing research in a lot of different disciplines, research projects, different areas. So what we mean when we say data can mean different things to many different people. So for today's session and for the purposes of a lot of federal funding and public access guidelines, they use this definition from the Code of Federal Regulations. And they define research data as the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. Now, when we're working with research data, there are several different sort of parts of a life cycle that data goes throughout a research project. And all of these are covered in many ways in data management and sharing plans, and talk about how you're going to work with data in each of these different parts of the research data lifecycle. I'm just going to go over this briefly, just to sort of lay things out. So that very first part of your research project is where the data management planning should be taking place, right? So you're conducting a review of any existing data that's out there or that you might reference during your project, investigating any potential challenges with data sharing or data storage, etc., identifying potential users of your data, creating your data management plan, etc. So that's something that should take place at the very beginning of the project, and I'll sort of reiterate that throughout today. The next part is really sort of the core part where we're collecting data. You're doing data analysis, managing data files, doing data organization, producing any sort of data documentation. And all of those will be referred to in your data management and sharing plans and how you're going to work with those. And then we take all of that and we get to the end of the project. And this is where we get into data sharing, how that data is going to be shared and made publicly available, how that's going to be archived, preserved, and stored for future use. So when we think of research data, there are many different types of data. There's some that are fairly obvious, things like spreadsheets or text documents, questionnaires, image data, audio data, things that we're producing throughout the research projects that are fairly straightforward. But there are also some components of research data and things that we're producing that may not be so obvious, but we still need to record them. We still need to talk about those in our data management and sharing plans. Things such as methodologies, workflows, standard operating procedures, any sort of models or collections of objects produced and generated during research. So these are some examples of data. This isn't a comprehensive list, obviously, but just to give you sort of a general idea. Now, there are a few things that are not considered research data. And when I say not research data, these are specifically things that you don't necessarily have to record in a data management and sharing plan. These are actually referred to in the NIH guidelines, a lot of different other funder guidelines of things you don't have to record. Sometimes it's a little hard to find. They're in kind of the general text for the different guidance. But a lot of these are things kind of referring to communications that you might have throughout a research project, like drafts of papers, plans for future research, communication that you might have with colleagues, or any sort of notes that you might take. So these, while they're important to the research process, they are very important to keep track of in your own workflows. They don't necessarily need to be accounted for in a data management and sharing plan unless otherwise noted. So we talked a little bit about data. So now we'll get into research data management. And so when we think about research data management as a concept, it's really a broad concept that includes all these different processes that we've sort of referred to at the beginning. So all of the processes to create organized, documented, accessible, and reusable quality research data. So it includes all of the different things that we talk about in our data management and sharing plans. And when we think about why we might want to manage research data, why this is important to the research process, I sort of like to use this carrot and stick model and points to illustrate this. Some of the carrots for managing research data include saving time. So properly managing research data from the beginning of a research project throughout that research project is really in the best interest of the researcher and folks that are working on research projects. It's going to save a lot of time later on, being able to locate the data, locate any associated metadata, so that we're not 2 years into the project and maybe you have to renew that grant and you have to go and find all those different data files. You have to figure out a storage and organization system. So doing it at the beginning is going to save a lot of time and frustration later on. It also has the potential to increase citations. So well-managed data is easier to share. It's easier to make publicly available. which can lead to the data and the data sets themselves being cited. A lot of data has persistent identifiers, connects back to publications, so it can help increase the impact of that research. It enhances reproducibility by making the methodology that one is using to create and process and analyze that data more transparent. And the final carrot is preserving data. Now, while data management encourages researchers to consider data storage, data backup, and data security measures, it also ensures that that data is preserved for long-term use, long-term accessibility, and not just stored. So it sort of focuses on that long-term ability to access and utilize and reuse that data. Now, the other side of that is the sticks. And this is, in a lot of cases, why folks are managing their data, why we're interested in research data management, is these required sharing guidelines, these required data management guidelines from different funding agencies, such as the NIH. So many different funding agencies, different journals require data sharing as a requirement of publication or as an award for a grant. And this includes most federal funding agencies, some private funding agencies as well. So this is sort of the main reasons why folks are interested, why we talk about research data management. It can also help prevent any sort of retractions that may come from missing data that may be discovered later on as well. So some common data management issues, and this is partially from experience and working with folks, and also part of the reason why these public access mandates were initially formed in the first place. As I mentioned earlier, waiting until the end of the project or waiting until later in the project to start data management can cost you a lot of time. It can cost a lot of frustration and even money, because time is money. This can be a major issue. Having incomplete or incoherent data, a lack of metadata or data documentation or documenting those workflows, documenting those methodologies, having data stored in file formats that are proprietary and that can't be accessed by folks that are using different software, different versions, and things like this. So these are sort of some of the issues, and that's where a lot of this guidance comes in, and that's what a lot of this is going to address as we go through. So sort of in response to a lot of these issues and for the need for research data and products of research to be made publicly available to the scientific community, to the general public at large, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, as part of the White House, has issued a couple of memorandums that sort of ask federal funding agencies to create policies and guidance for public access to research products, which includes scientific research data. So the first of those memos was issued in 2013, also known as the Holdren memo for the director of OSTP at the time. And this particular memo asked federal agencies that had over $100 million in annual R&D expenditures. So agencies such as the NSF, the NIH, DOE, sort of the major federal funding agencies, to create plans to support public access to research. And this included both publications and digital data. We'll focus on the data side today, obviously. And so as part of this, agencies were required to create guidelines for data management, data sharing for research that was funded from their agency. This did allow at the time for a 12-month post-publication embargo period for making publications publicly available, and also asked that any data resulting from research supported by federal funding to be stored and to be publicly accessible. And so this is where the data archival, data preservation guidance, and as part of DMP sort of came into place. And so this was sort of the original memorandum that a lot of agencies operated under for quite a while. Just last year, an updated memo was released, sort of a second memo from OSTP, also called the Nelson Memo. And this sort of built on that initial memorandum from 2013. And this required all federal funding agencies to create or update plans that they already had to support these public access guidelines. And so it eliminated that $100 million in grants threshold. And also asked that publications data be made publicly available immediately upon publication. So it removed that sort of embargo period. And it also talks about data not associated with peer-reviewed publications, so data produced as part of a research project, but maybe not as part of a publication, to now be covered under that data access requirement. So this one is relatively new. Agencies are still updating their guidelines in response to this memo. So this isn't fully in effect yet. And the NIH guidance had already come out, as we know, way before this actually was released. And so that pretty much meets all of these guidelines. But if you work with research or you write any grants for agencies like NSF or DOE or any other agencies, this may have an effect in the coming months. So do keep an eye on that. Excuse me. All right. So now we'll get into data management plans. We'll get into the actual guidance for these. And as I said, we'll start out fairly general, just talking about data management plans, what's typically involved in a data management and sharing plan. And then we'll focus on the new NIH guidelines. So to meet these federal requirements for public access to research, the government and some private funders have started requiring data management plans with all grant applications. Some have been doing it for some time. These plans are usually about 2 pages. It varies depending on the agency, but most federal agencies ask that plans are about 2 pages long, and the NIH asks that the new DMSPs conform to this length. So these are fairly brief. They essentially are an overview of how one is going to share data, store data, archive data, work with it throughout the research project. Now, plans and guidance do vary a bit between different agencies, different types of research, because different types of research have different data considerations. But generally, all plans have some similar components and things that you would want to address. And this includes things like where and how the data is going to be archived and shared, any sort of data privacy, copyright, or IP rights that may be associated if that's applicable, how that data is going to be documented, how those methodologies and workflows are going to be documented, the type of data, any file formats associated with that data, any data security or encryption considerations, and then data storage and backups, how that data is going to be backed up throughout the research project. So that's in general. So you'll see some similarities between guidance if you say are working with multiple agencies, have to write multiple DMPs over time. But for today, since a lot of us are interested in the new NIH guidelines, and these do take effect January 25th, so next week, we're going to focus on the new NIH data sharing policy. And so under this new NIH data management and sharing policy, all researchers that are applying for NIH funding that generates scientific data are required to submit one of these data management and sharing plans. And the NIH has prescribed 6 elements for the new data management and sharing plans, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. But each plan should contain elements such as the data type, any related tools, software, or code associated with the research, any standards, data preservation, access, and associated timelines, access, distribution, or reuse consideration, and then a section on oversight for the data management and sharing plan. So in thinking about these different elements and what exactly they mean and what exactly should go into each component of these, I'm going to go over these briefly. There's more information on the NIH data management and sharing page, which I'll link later on in the presentation, but this should hopefully give a good overview of what should be included in each of these components. So the first component is data type. And when we say data type, we're talking about the types and the amount of scientific data to be generated and used in a research project. And so this can include things like the data modality. So whether you're working with imaging data or genomic data, survey data, etc., the level of aggregation for that data, the degree of data processing, what file formats that data is going to be stored under. This will also include a brief description of which data will be preserved and shared during the project. The NIH does not necessarily expect all data to be shared. There are exceptions for like human subject studies and things like that. And those are talked about a little bit later in their guidance. But which of that data will be preserved and shared? And then a brief description of any metadata or associated data documentation. So things like README files or code books or data dictionaries that are going to be used or created throughout the project. The second is related tools, software, or code. So this is where you would list any specialized tools that are needed to access or manipulate data. So we talked about file formats a little bit earlier, and as we all know, if we're working with certain software or certain instruments, those are going to produce specific file types, and those might need specific software or tools to analyze and to process. So NIH asks that you list any tools that are needed to access or manipulate data and how those tools can be accessed. If you are using completely non-proprietary or universal file formats, you would just mention that here and say that using universal file formats, no specialized tools are needed to manipulate or access this data. The third element is standards. And this applies primarily to metadata standards and how that data is going to be documented, what fields you're going to use and record when you are documenting methodologies, workflows, any other administrative data that's part of that project. And I do want to briefly segue and talk about data documentation, because this is an important component of research data management and data management plans. And so when we're talking about data documentation, we're really talking about descriptive information about a data set that explains its meaning and enables others to use that data and to reuse that data if they're interested for their own projects. And there are several different types of data documentation. I list some of the more common ones here that are typically used. And these include things like README files, data dictionaries, file directories. And the fields that you'll include in documentation for your data are going to vary based on discipline and based on the fields. They'll sometimes vary based on the repository or archival solution that you're using as well. But you typically include information such as who is working on the project, any dates that are associated with the project, a general description of that project, any persistent identifiers that are associated with that project, or any previous work. So this is really important to keep track of and to document. It's going to greatly enhance the shareability and reproducibility of the research data that's associated with any sort of project. So continuing on, we went through the first half of those NIH elements. The fourth element is data preservation, access, and associated timelines. And this is where we begin to talk about data repositories or data archival solutions. And in this section is where one would detail any plans and timelines for data preservation and access, and the repositories, or just repository, where data and metadata from a project will be archived. And we'll talk a little bit about data repositories later on and some resources for identifying appropriate data repositories, because that is a little bit longer of a discussion. One would also include how that data will be findable and identifiable once it is archived. So whether that's via a persistent unique identifier or other standard indexing tools, and when the data will be made available. What timeline is that data on to be made publicly available, and for how long? And if there are subsets of that data that have different timelines for various reasons, this would also be the place to note that. Access, distribution, or reuse considerations are the fifth element. And this includes any applicable factors affecting the subsequent access, distribution, or reuse of that scientific data, anything that's going to affect that data sharing, or would maybe be an exception where you wouldn't share that data. And we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide, because there is some more information there. And then the final element is oversight. And this is where one would indicate how compliance with the data management and sharing plan will be monitored, the frequency of the oversight, and by whom. So essentially, who is responsible for making sure the data management and sharing plan is followed, everything that's laid out there, and all of those workflows are set up. This is often going to be the PI or maybe a senior researcher on the project, but this is where that information would be included. So I did want to touch a little bit more on access, distribution, and reuse. This is specifically referred to on the NIH site. And a lot of this includes information on like human studies, any types of exceptions that may be had under the GDS or the genomic data sharing policy are included here. But there are some factors that might affect access and reuse of the data, including things such as informed consent, if that is required for, say, human subjects research, any privacy and confidentiality protections that are consistent with federal, tribal, state, and local laws or guidance, whether access to scientific data derived from human participants will be controlled. And then any other restrictions that are placed by federal or state laws or regulations. And many of these will also come up if you are working on an institutional review board application and any exceptions to this policy. These are outlined in more detail on the NIH site and our Office of Human Subjects Protection page, which I'll have a link to that at the end of the presentation. But these are some potential exceptions depending on your area of research that you might want to consider when you are writing your data management and sharing plan. I also wanted to touch a little bit on data repositories, because this is one of the new components that was emphasized in that NIH guidance, and sort of talk about what a data repository is, some things to consider when selecting a particular and appropriate data repository. So data repositories were set up really back when those initial federal sharing and public access guidelines were initiated as a way for researchers to archive their data and make it publicly available. And these repositories curate and archive data utilizing this FAIR acronym. So FAIR is an acronym that stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So making sure that that data is findable and accessible by researchers, by machines, that it's interoperable, that it can be utilized by different machines, different instruments, that it can be read, and that it's reusable by the research community. There's a few different types of data repositories. I'm just going to talk briefly about kind of what each of these are and some general considerations to think about when selecting a repository. The first type is discipline specific. So many disciplines have specific repositories where data for that discipline or that research area is shared and archived. It has folks that can curate that data that are knowledgeable about that particular area. And there are hundreds of these types of repositories. A good place to find information about those repositories and to search for those if you don't have a specified repository for your project is the Registry of Research Data Repositories, or Re3 Data. It's a nice sort of database collection that links out to many different data repositories for specific research areas and subjects. The next one is a generalist repository, and these differ from discipline-specific repositories in that these are meant for a larger set of disciplines. These are broader in scale. So it may be all STEM data or all social sciences data, or it may even be interdisciplinary, as a lot of them are. And these include repositories such as Figshare or Dryad, which is sort of a broader repository for certain types of data. But these can be useful if you don't have a specific data repository or there's not a specific repository for a certain discipline. And the NIH actually does list a few of these on their site. There is a project for a few generalist repositories that are supported by NIH. And the final type of repository that I'll mention is an institutional repository. So many institutions, including Florida State, have repositories where researchers from their institution can deposit their research, can deposit their data. At FSU, our repository is called Diginal. And these repositories can be very useful for certain types of data. There are specific requirements, storage limitations for some of these, but depending on your data type, depending on your research, these can also be applicable. And the NIH does provide some tips for selecting a data repository. And this really falls into sort of two different categories or two different things. So for some programs, for some grants, some offices, they will specify a particular data repository that you should use to preserve and share data. And in that case, it's very straightforward. You utilize whatever repository or repositories that are referred to from the funding announcement. But there are many funding announcements, many calls that don't necessarily specify a particular repository. And so this is when you will need to consider which repository that you're going to use. There are some quote unquote desirable characteristics for a repository. They don't necessarily have to have all of these, but do sort of give consideration to repositories that are discipline or data type specific. If you're working with a specific type of data and there's a repository for that, utilizing that will probably work for your particular project. But also considering whether that repository includes unique persistent identifiers for the data, whether data on that repository is accompanied by sufficient data documentation and metadata, and whether those requirements are sufficient, whether that's accessible and has broad and measurable reuse for that data. So that data can be reused by the scientific community, and that they have proper security and integrity guidelines in place that sort of prevent unauthorized access to or modification of any type of research data. So those are some general guidelines. There are some additional considerations if you're working with human participant data. So those require a different level of security, different levels of protections, and for things like informed consent. So if you're working with that type of data, those would also be some considerations to consider. And I will mention now, and I'll mention it later on, if you're working on a project, if you're working on a data management and sharing plan, and you're trying to figure out which repository to use, trying to select the best repository for your project, myself, other folks are always happy to help with this process and to sort of work through the different repositories that are available, because there are quite a few. So we've talked about now the NIH guidelines, sort of provided an overview of those, talked about what data management is, and looked through that process. I did want to sort of take the rest of the time that I'm speaking and talk about some resources that you can refer to or that you can use when creating a data management and sharing plan. And these resources are very useful, whether it's the first time you're creating a DMP or whether you've created DMPs before and just sort of want some templates or sort of an easier, more straightforward workflow for creating those plans. And one of the tools that I'm going to talk about a little bit and just give a brief demo of is something called the Data Management Plan tool, or the DMP tool. This is an awesome tool. Was created in response to the demands from funding agencies and memorandums, particularly the memorandum from OSTP back in 2013, for researchers to create data management and sharing plans for their research data. This tool is maintained by it's based out of the UC system, but it is maintained and guided by data librarians and professionals and folks like myself that are working with researchers on data management plans throughout the country. And what's really nice is it provides templates that one can use to craft data management plans. It's designed around guidance from the different funding agencies, so you can look for whatever particular agency that you are submitting a plan for, and provides links to resources and tools and to specific guidance from that agency that you can reference when creating that plan. FSU is a DMP tool member institution, so anyone associated with FSU can create and save a plan, can update, and can invite collaborators to plans as well. So I did want to just briefly show kind of how that works and how the tool works. And so to do that, I'm going to get out of my presentation. And then I'm going to go to the DMP tool site. So it's dmptool.org, and there will be a link for this in the final slides of the presentation later on, so that you have that for reference. But to sort of sign in and get started, and this is whether you're using it for the first time or whether you've used the tool before, you just enter your FSU email address, and then should see that your address is associated with FSU, and then just do single sign on with your institution, sign in with your FSU credentials, and then that should take you to your DMP tool dashboard, as it's called. This will be the first page that you see when you log in. If you are new to the tool, you obviously won't see anything. I've used this for quite a while, hence why I have a bunch of things on the dashboard. Your first time in, it may ask you to create a brief profile, which is just a few questions on kind of you and your institution, contact, etc. But this is where you would go to actually start a plan and to create a plan. So you'll see there's a button down here for creating a plan. And I'm going to show what this page looks like, and then I'm going to go into a demonstration plan that I already have set up for this workshop. But you go to this Create Plan button, and this is where you would start if you wanted to use this tool to create your data management plan. So you can write in what research project you're planning, what your research project is about. You can use the title of maybe the grant application. Select the primary research organization. If you're with FSU and you've logged in through FSU, this should already be listed here, so you don't have to worry about that. And then this is where you'll select your funding organization. And so if you say are working with NIH, National Institutes of Health, you would type in NIH, you would click that. And then many agencies have different directorates or different guidance under their umbrella. So like NSF, for instance, if you've worked with NSF before, there are several different directorates. Each one of them has slightly different guidance. So there's a specific template for each of those directorates. For the NIH, there's just really a couple that you would have to worry about. If you are working with data under the genomic data sharing policy, there is some templates and guidance for that. But mostly what you would be using is this new NIH DMSP. It still says forthcoming by next week. That one, it will just be the general NIH template. And then this is what the NIH data sharing plans were before 2023. So there is a brief template for that as well. So once you do that and you hit create plan, what this is going to do is, now I'm going to go to the plan that I already have set up, is it will take you to sort of the portal or the pages that you can use to actually create your data management and sharing plan. So there's several different fields on here. There's one for project details. So this is sort of administrative type data. So the title of the project, a brief description of the project, project dates, the funding agency, and then funding status. So whether you are submitting a plan, whether it's been funded, you can change this kind of throughout the project, and then any sort of funding opportunity number or grant number. The second tab is for collaborators. And so if you are working with other researchers, if this is a collaborative project and you want to include others on the data management plan, you want to invite others to be able to view this, to edit this within the DMP tool. If you want to, say, invite me as the data management librarian to review and look at your plan in the DMP tool, this is where you would add collaborators. And you can give them permission to read only, just to be able to view this. You can give them permission to edit, or you can make them a co-owner of the data management plan. Then this tab is where you would actually go to write the plan. So if you remember the different elements of the NIH data management and sharing plan, you'll see all of those different fields here. And if we say click on data type, this will have a few different things. This will sort of briefly have some of the text a lot of times taken right from the funding agency guidance for these different sections. Data type is sort of broken down into 3 different components because there are different elements that were addressed in the guidance. So you see some brief information here. This is where you would actually enter the text for your plan. And one of the nice things about the NIH template that the folks that worked on this template did was sort of put in some example text for this that you can edit for your own research, for your own institution. So I'm just going to do a kind of brief copy and paste if that allows me to. Okay, it didn't. Okay, I'm actually going to go off screen for a second and do that. I have some saved over here. So what you would do is just enter that into the field right here. And you can do this for all of these different fields and then hit save. And so this will save the text you've already included. And you see now you have completed one of the components for your data management and sharing plan. You can come back to these. This will save this. It will save your progress. You don't have to do all of these components at once. So you can go through each of these different components. There is also some guidance and tips that are available in this right-hand sort of drop-down menu as well. So this includes things from the NIH guidance, some brief tips and information from the DMP tool curators themselves. So maybe what is meant by data description, what is meant by data format. So all of this is included here. And there's also a box where you can share any comments or questions you say have for your collaborators or while you're working on the project. So this is where sort of the meat and potatoes is for writing your plan. There is also a field for research outputs. This is relatively new. It's just sort of added into the tool within the last year or two. And this is where you can actually provide information on like a data set or any sort of data products or outputs that are associated with the research that are going to be covered under the data management and sharing plan. You can include information about your intended repository or repositories for the project, the different metadata standards that you might be adding. And so this is sort of really nice and sort of connects the data management and sharing plans to sort of broader research outputs to the broader community, provides more connections that way. And so sort of the last two tabs are these finalize and download tabs. Within the DMP tool, you can set your plans to be visible privately, so only to you, any collaborators and organization admins. This is the default for all plans. You can also set to make them visible public or to public only at your organization as well. And then the last thing is you can actually register your plan for a DMP ID. And these are specific digital object identifiers, so persistent identifiers specifically for data management plans. And what this allows you to do is link this plan to your ORCID as a project output or as a research output. That can be associated with data sets, journal articles that will sort of allow you to demonstrate that those funder requirements, those data management requirements are met kind of throughout the project and by the end of the project. And there are some specific guidelines for doing that. And they become more available once you actually complete your plan. I've only completed one part, so it won't let me do any of that now. And then finally, once you create it within the tool, you are able to download all of that information that you wrote out in Write Plan and download that you know, as a PDF or as a text document or a Word document, so you can submit that with your grant or so that you can work on that more in that way. So this is a really great tool, really great resource. I highly encourage you to check it out if you are working on data management sharing plan. You're looking for some templates. There's a lot of different information and examples out there, which we'll talk about briefly here in a second, but this sort of collates a lot of that information really nicely into one place. And so you can have that while you're working on your plans. All right, I am going to get back out and get back into my slideshow. And I have a couple of slides within the presentation that sort of talk about the different parts of the DMP tool and sort of briefly go over those different components. So as these new these guidelines for NIH and sharing policies are new, a lot of folks, you know, might be asking or wondering if there's like public plans or example plans or templates out there. The answer is yes. There's been a lot of those created sort of within the last few months. by the NIH, by the research community, by data librarians. And so I just wanted to link to a few of those. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. These are mainly for your reference. But the DMP tool site that we were just on has a tab for publicly available plans, researchers that have made those plans publicly available. So you can take a look at those and see what other researchers have done. And this includes plans from all the different funding agencies that are represented. So I specifically linked if you're working on an NSF plan at any point. So a couple of examples there. There are several examples of NIH data management and sharing plans. The NIH has put out several templates within the last few weeks. There's also a working group of data librarians and other information professionals that are really working on a whole suite of resources for the new NIH policy. But they have specifically created this sort of annotated data management and sharing plan. And I'll just show that briefly. And so what this did essentially is took a sort of resource sharing plan that was written prior to the 2023 guidance, sort of put that into the new elements, the new structure, and also provide some tips for each of the particular sections and some particular notes as you're working. So this is an example that you can sort of refer to if you're looking for that as one resource. All right, so we'll just finish up here in a minute or two, and then we'll have some time for questions. There are many different resources here at Florida State and throughout the research community if you are working on your data management and sharing plans. And I list a few on here. There's likely more that I forgot. But myself and other folks at FSU Libraries are more than happy to help you while you are writing, creating, reviewing your data management plan. We provide consultations, instruction, workshops such as this. We can tailor training sessions for specific groups. So if you have a research group or a department that you want maybe a more specific training or some time to actually sit down and dive into some of these elements, we're more than happy to provide that at any time. Just feel free to reach out. We have a research data management guide that has been created, and we update that periodically and maintain that. So that has a lot of resources and links to helpful information. We also collaborate and work with other research offices across campus, and they also provide support for different components of the grant process, for the data management process. So folks at the Office of Research Development, the Office of Research Compliance that can help answer any questions related to data management compliance. The Sponsored Research Administration, which I don't have on here, but it's very important. If you have any questions about DMS plan related costs or what costs that you can include, these would be the folks that you reach out to. The Office of Human Subjects Protection, if you have questions about data derived through human study participants. And then the FSU Health Data Sciences Initiative, Joe Brigham and April Lovett specifically, but other folks from ITS and the libraries as well, can help provide letters to grant agencies regarding any sort of data security or data privacy implications, and help provide IRB language if they're working within the FSU ITS environment. And then last but not least, community resources, the DMP tool, which I already mentioned. There's a listing of different funder policies linked here as well. The open science framework, if you're looking for sort of both a data management and like project management tool to sort of manage your entire research workflow. Our open science librarian and our scholarly communications librarian within FSU Libraries are working on some trainings on OSF as well and other open science related topics. So keep a lookout for those if you're interested in learning more. Re3 data, which I mentioned a little bit earlier for looking at different data repositories. That working group on NIH data management and sharing plan guidance, which includes that annotated plan that I showed earlier, but also has a really nice checklist for researchers as you're going through the different elements of your plan, like what you need to include. If checklists are of interest and are helpful. And then I include a link to the NIH scientific data sharing page where you can get information directly from NIH on this different guidance. All right, and if you ever want to reach out, contact me, set up a consultation, set up time to talk about your data management and sharing plans. Please do reach out. I put my contact email here and they'll be in the slides that Nicole will distribute after the presentation. So happy to chat, happy to help y'all as we're navigating this new landscape of data management and sharing with the new NIH guidance and new policies and guidance that'll be coming out from other funders sort of over the next few months. And with that concludes the presentation component for me. And so now we have a good like 25-ish minutes or so that we can take any questions that y'all have.
Thank you, Nick. So we do have one question that came in regarding clinicaltrials.gov registration and whether those constitute the same level of sharing as a data repository. So from my understanding, I believe that you only need to share summary results from your projects on clinicaltrials.gov, not the entire data set. But we do also have some representatives here from our Office of Clinical Research Advancement, and they do help with compliance with clinicaltrials.gov requirements. So Sharon, if you're still here, you might know better than I do that there is not a requirement to load your data set necessarily into clinical trials. Is that correct?
Hey everyone, sorry. You're not required to load the entire data set. It would be a summary, but it also depends on your funder and then also the source, the trial in general. So it would be more specific to the actual trial that in discussion as opposed to general guidelines.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that asks, if we have worked through the DMP tool with NIH FSU examples and templates to generate our own a priori DMSP, are there opportunities to obtain feedback on it before submitting it? Would a consultation be the best option?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy to provide feedback before that's submitted. A consultation would be a great way to do that. I can also, if added as a collaborator on the DMP tool, can also provide feedback in that sort of little comment section that I showed there as well. And those would be visible to whoever is working on the data management plan. But if you have specific questions or concerns or want some specific feedback on any one element, a consultation would be a good way to sort of talk about those and get some feedback.
Great. And Soma, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah. Hey, my name is Soma, and I have a slightly, maybe a couple of questions, but let me try to be brief. I run a shared facility, like several shared facilities. We collect data for a lot of PIs who are funded with NIH and NSF. Obviously, they will create a DMP saying they will preserve the data. We may not or may know their plans, but eventually, does the responsibility fall on the PI or does the responsibility fall on the core facility? I assume even if it is a PI, what the shared facilities responsibility and how long we keep the data, how we do that. It's kind of a long question, but you see my problem. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the ultimate responsibility for the data management and sort of the actual data does fall on the PI if that PI has submitted the plan. So it's technically their responsibility, to make sure that they have all of the information, all of the data, all of the documentation that they need to comply with those guidelines.
I understand that, but eventually it comes to us, right? I mean, you say that it has to be made at the beginning of the project. I mean, I have more than 30 years of data, and then it's becoming larger and larger. And of course, with the electron microscopy data, it's even impossible to preserve. Maybe we should talk to you about this preservation of the data, because the amount of storage is like genomics data is humongous. And I don't know whether DigiNode or would be sufficient to store any of this data. Maybe offline we have to talk about this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to kind of talk through and sort of like figure out a strategy, kind of see like kind of the different questions there. Because yeah, that's a lot of data, and we can kind of work through and kind of talk about different storage solutions for that, and different preservation. So yep, happy to talk more.
Any other questions from our audience members or any of our representatives from other offices across FSU want to chime in with your thoughts or perspectives? All right, well, I'll just put in a pitch for our mock review panel program for the Office of Research Development. So if you are submitting an NIH grant, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can coordinate a mock review for your entire proposal. And within that, we can focus specifically on attachments, not just the specific aims and the research strategy, but things like your data management and sharing plan, your biosketch, or other critical components that will go into either the review or the funding decision. So if you are submitting a grant coming up and you do want us to pay special attention to documents like these, please reach out to me and I'm happy to help with questions related to that. Howard?
Hey, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Nicole. For those on the call that work with human subjects data, as Nick indicated in the slide deck, and you'll get it later, there is access to the Office of Human Subject Protection's webpage on the NIH Data Management Sharing Policy. And through that webpage, we provide access to a number of templates that you can use to describe the use and restrictions on human research data that you can incorporate it into your plan. Also, in the templated protocols and the consent forms that you may be using for human research, there are now new sections and links within those templates that both describe the information that you need to include in the informed consent document and the information you need to include in your study protocol as you prepare them for submission in RAMP IRB. And those templates, the language as well as the links, are consistent with the new NIH policy. And I encourage you to review those templates so that you don't have to hunt and peck for the type of language that you need to put into your plan that you submit to NIH to make sure it's going to be consistent with what the IRB will expect as part of your IRB application. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Howard. Any other questions from our audience? All right, any last thoughts, Nick, that you want to share?
I'll just, put in another pitch for, if you have any specific questions at any point, or if you're working on a DMP and you want to have either a consultation, or if you want one of these training specific for like your research group or for department, I'm happy to do that as well. So just feel free to reach out or contact me anytime.